Thanks for joining us on this edition of Business Daily. Coming to you live from Seoul, I'm Lee Ji-yoon. We have plenty on our plate today, so let's get started with a look at the day's highlights. The world's largest multilateral organizations, including the IMF and the World Bank, have stepped up cooperation to fight tax evasion together. As concerns are growing over Korea's slowing economic growth, the government is zoning in on carrying out structural reforms in a number of problem sectors. These stories and more coming right up. But first, Korea's producer prices edged down to their lowest point in 6 years last month, continuing the steady downward streak they've been on for quite some time. The Bank of Korea says preliminary data for March indicates that prices were down 0.1% from the previous month. The drop mainly came from lower electricity, gas, and other utility costs, which slid by over 3% from February. With producer prices being a major indicator for consumer prices, it's widely forecast that inflation levels will remain low. Korea's benchmark Kospi rose slightly over 1.75% in the first 3 months of this year. With this increase, the main bourse ranked 17th out of the world's 40 major stock markets in performance. According to Seoul-based Daejeon Securities, the nation's stocks fared relatively well amid a slowing global economy, but saw limited growth due to slack trading in neighboring countries such as China and Japan. The Shanghai Composite was down 15.1%, while the Nikkei 225 lost nearly 12% over the first quarter. Of the 21 underperforming nations, 13 were European, affected by the struggling banking system and Britain's possible exit from the European Union. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are joining arms with other global organizations to fight tax evasion following the recent revelation of the Panama Papers. Our Park Jong-won tells us more.
4 global organizations are combining efforts to tackle tax evasion. The initiative, led by the IMF and the World Bank, also includes the United Nations and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The joint platform will collaborate on tax issues and developing new tools and standards to halt tax-based erosion and evasion, with a primary focus on helping developing nations better combat tax evasion. The announcement comes on the heels of the leakage of the so-called Panama Papers that triggered an international outcry. The documents revealed the widespread use of tax havens and shell companies by global elites and corporations to hide assets and avoid paying taxes. For starters, the joint group will deliver what insiders call toolkits to developing countries to help them deal with corporations using accounting tactics to lower their tax bills. Another goal is to develop appropriate policies for the taxation of multinational enterprises. Park Jong-hong, Business Daily.
Today is Korea's Day for the Disabled, and to create more employment opportunities for people with disabilities, the government says it plans to adopt a carrot-and-stick approach for companies, with the hopes of improving not only the quantity but also the quality of their jobs. Our Hwang Ho-jun has this report.
The Korean government announced on Tuesday that it will increase its efforts to expand employment opportunities for people with disabilities. Speaking at the Seoul Customized Training Center, Prime Minister Hwang Kyo-won emphasized the importance of participation of both the government and corporations in order to improve the lives of those with special needs. One of the policies that Hwang pointed out was the Exemplary Subsidized Companies program for people with disabilities, and said the government will expand such initiative.
The Exemplary Subsidized Company program is a prototype that would increase both the quantity and quality of employment.
A fairly new concept conceived by the Employment Ministry, this is how the system works. If the parent company has a lower employment rate of people with disabilities than the minimum requirement, the government will encourage that company to establish a separate subsidiary, with the government supporting 75% of the investment, so that the company would be able to hire more people with disabilities. The catch is that the parent company must invest or own more than 50% of shares. If the parent company follows through before the end of 2016, the government will provide tax support for the next 3 years. In other words, it's a second chance for companies to hire more people with disabilities.
If companies decide not to do this, they will be fined since they didn't meet the minimum requirements in terms of employment rate of people with disabilities in the first place.
With already 42 exemplary subsidized companies having been confirmed since 2008, the government looks to increase that number by pressuring 76 affiliated companies that have an employment rate of people with disabilities lower than 1.5% to follow the model, as the statutory minimum stands at 2.7%. Hwang Ho-jun, Business Daily.
Korea's corporate governance is coming under the spotlight once again, and this time it's the Korea Exchange, calling for reform to lift the long-standing added risks foreign investors see in the country's top companies. Our Eunice Kim explains.
Mismanaged succession battles, as seen in the turbulent fight for control between brothers at Lotte Group. Samsung's controversial C&T merger that went through to further solidify the Lee family's control over some outspoken shareholder opposition. These are examples of the so-called chaebol risk unique to Korea due to the owner family's overwhelming influence over key business decisions made possible through a web of cross-shareholding. As a result, overseas investors have priced in the risk in their equity decisions, undervaluing Korean stocks, a phenomenon known as the Korea discount. In fact, Korea was ranked among the bottom on corporate governance among its Asian peers. A 2014 biennial evaluation put the country lower than Thailand and Taiwan. And on Monday, the Korea Exchange, together with its think tank Korea Corporate Governance Service, pushed for improving an existing best practice guideline in a policy debate. Addressing a void, it wants to build in a comprehensive management succession program as the norm. And the company board of directors that would establish it and regularly review candidates, KRX said, should themselves not have any reasons for disqualification.
Because succession tends to happen within the ranks of family, there's no clear process in place. Not only do we want companies to create this, but also disclose it to shareholders.
The hearing was well attended by members of Korea's largest companies. But as the guideline is just that, recommendations, it remains to be seen how seriously the decision makers at the top will move. This comes as Korea's chaebol began their fourth-generation succession. 11th largest Tusan Group saw its founder's great-grandson, Park Chung-won, take the helm in March, with similar moves expected to come in LG, GS, and Korong Group. Eunice Kim, Business Daily.
Red meat and processed meats are known to increase people's chances of getting colorectal cancer, which is the third most common type of cancer among Koreans. And as love for meat continues to climb in the country, the government is looking to improve people's eating habits. Our Lee Joo-young has more.
From the thick, fatty slices of pork belly's samgyeopsal to fried chicken smothered in sauce, Koreans' love for meat has never been higher. Citing figures from the OECD, the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs said the country's per capita meat consumption reached a record 51.3 kilograms in 2014, increasing almost 45% over the span of a decade. That means one person eats roughly 342 servings of meat a year. The ministry said pork was by far the most popular choice among Koreans, taking up nearly a quarter of the total intake, followed by chicken and beef. Unlike other countries like the US, Australia, and Canada, Koreans still have a greater preference for red meat, a trend that tends to change as people become more health conscious. Efforts to raise awareness about health conditions associated with excessive meat consumption are gradually becoming more visible in Korea. After the World Health Organization released a report indicating red and processed meat have high links to risks of colorectal, pancreatic, and prostate cancer, the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety said it will release preliminary guidelines on recommended meat intake for consumers. It also plans to release a smartphone application by December that calculates the user's meat consumption levels and require the labeling of processed meat content on foods to curb overconsumption by minors. Lee Ju-young, Business Daily.
Following his trip to Washington for a G20 financial leaders meeting, Korea's Finance Minister Yoo Il-ho is amping up the government's reform efforts to raise the country's growth potential. This as concerns rise over low growth becoming a trend here in Korea, which still has a long way ahead to catch up with other advanced economies. For more on the government's policies for economic reforms, we're now joined by our Hwang Jae in the studio. So Ji-hye, we hear that Minister Yoo has stepped up efforts to, bring about reforms in the industrial sector. Can you tell us more about this?
Sure. Meeting reporters on Tuesday, you said that the government will push ahead with structural reforms in the industrial sector. So while continuing its efforts in reforming the labor, finance, public, and education sectors, the government is trying to foster new growth engines that can raise the competitiveness of the country's overall economy. Possible candidates for this would be those related to the Internet of Things, big data, and artificial intelligence. Minister Yoo added, though, that not all industries will receive government support, with many carrying high risks of failure. Yoo said the government will select and concentrate only on a few. And this move to prop up budding industries is in line with his earlier comments vowing to personally oversee corporate restructuring. That is, ailing conventional industries that once led growth in the country. On Tuesday, he emphasized once again that the restructuring process will speed up in the first half of this year.
So I guess this shows that the government is focusing more on longer-term issues than short-term measures to boost the local economy, right?
Yes, the government assessment seems to be that short-term measures like drawing up extra budget or a key interest rate cut cannot be a cure-all for the country to get out of its slow growth concerns. That's because, as central banker Governor Lee Ju-yeol has mentioned earlier, the current feeble pace of recovery is not stemming from cyclical factors, but from structural issues. Korea's traditional growth engine exports have been losing steam, falling for the 15th straight month in March, the longest downward streak the country has ever posted. The shipbuilding and shipping industries in particular have been facing ballooning losses on the back of plunging oil prices and a global economic downturn. But experts say pushing ahead with the reform efforts in all 5 sectors will not be an easy task and that they will need parliamentary approval.
And structural reform has been always on the administration's plan. However, with the opposition parties in power now, the labor market reform will be more difficult to deliver.
Now, major financial institutions, including the BOK, have downgraded the country's growth outlook to the 2% range. So I'm sure that they have pressure about bringing in more stimulus now.
Definitely. The BOK has cut its growth projection yesterday to 2.8%, down from its earlier projection of 3%. And the central bank's fresh outlook is in line with many global and local financial institutions that expect Korea to grow in the 2% range, making it look almost certain that Korea is falling into a low growth trap. The country's GDP growth stood at 3.7% in 2011, but plunged to 2.3% the next year. Ever since then, the growth rate has remained in the 2% range, except for in 2014.
What is more urgent now is short-term stimulus measures. Both the BOK and the Finance Ministry seem reluctant about it, but they really need to give it more consideration. Raising the growth potential is an issue of the future, but we won't be able to realize it if we don't survive now.
So if there are more calls for easing, why are the central government and the central bank, that is, and the government reluctant to move on it?
If the government injects money into the economy through a supplementary budget, it's going to be a burden to the country's fiscal soundness, and rate cuts, of course, would also come with their own set of side effects. It can cause foreign investors to pull out of Korea and further push up household debt levels that already stand at around $1 trillion. The top central banker has also been raising skepticism about the effectiveness of a rate trim, adding that a cut alone cannot be effective in boosting growth and that monetary policies need to go in hand with fiscal policies and structural reforms.
All right, thank you so much for the report today, Jihae.
You're welcome.
And that wraps it up for today, but we'll be back tomorrow at the same time, same place for your Business Daily, so don't forget to tune in then. Thanks for watching and see you soon.